Well, first I want to thank Professor Sakan for Sharon for inviting us to talk to your class, and also for you all to be here to listen to what I may say that is good or bad. And also I want to thank Martha Nakagawa for being my moral support and a very important critic. And I will talk about basically I was asked to talk as a Japanese American girl pre and post internment. And also touch on women's history or equality. Martha asked me by email, would I possibly talk to a women's history class at Cal State Fullerton? I reluctantly said no. And she says, well, would you please think about it? And I says, well, I'll think about it, but I am not a public speaker, nor have I been formally taught in public speaking. But since Martha has been so involved in all these Japanese community activities, volunteers so much time, and knows so much about the Japanese history, with much trepidation, I said, yes, I will speak to the class. And she emailed me back and she says, awesome. Well, I quickly looked in the dictionary to see what awesome really meant. And the dictionary's definition of the word awesome: respectful fear inspired by authority. Also a feeling of wonder and reverence inspired by anything of great beauty, sublimity, majesty, or power. An example of awesome was when I was in camp, and I had to hide under the steps because I was so intimidated for the first few months when I started school. My mother, who worked in a mess hall, always knew where to find me because I was under the steps. I was so afraid. I finally outgrew, some of that insecurity when I found school to be quite challenging and interesting. Well, my given name is Yoshiko Masamoto. When my older brother was born, they forgot to put his English name on the birth certificate, so for subsequent children, they left out our English name. So my name is Irene. Basically, I go by Irene and sign my name Irene Y. Kuromiya. I was born in Fresno, delivered by a midwife, because back in those days, back in the Stone Age, we didn't have regular hospitals, and only the rich probably were born in the hospital, but it really didn't hear of many people being born in the hospital. We lived in a small rural country home in Sanger, and then moved later into even a smaller rural area called Centerville. They were both in Fresno County and the central San Joaquin Valley. I don't remember much of my younger years, but just playing with my siblings, because there were 3 of us, altogether were 4. And I didn't even know the meaning of different nationalities. I thought we were all Japanese because we only had periodic visits with my relatives or my adult friends, and they never brought their children over. My father is an Issei, first generation, born in Hiroshima, and my mother is a Nisei Kide, who was educated in Japan, and they both came over, not together, when they were in their teens. They quickly learned English, learned how to read, write, and speak English within a couple of years. When the Executive Order 9066 was issued, I think it took all of the Japanese people by surprise. What was happening? What was going to happen? Where were we going? There were many questions and no one provided us answers. I was 5 years old, My brother was 8.5 years old, and my two sisters were 7 and 3. The FBI was picking up community leaders and reported them as potential saboteurs. We were surprised that my father was not picked up because he was quite active in the Japanese school and the Buddhist church. My mother was afraid that he would be picked up, so she kept quiet and also felt very anxious. They were hearing stories from their friends that the FBI were also picking up leaders and putting them into prison. She thought to herself, how will I care for my 4 children if the father is in prison? Luckily, he was not picked up. We had to hurry and find a storage shed for our meager belongings because they didn't give us much time to pack and sort, and besides we were rather poor and we didn't have that much belongings. But we finally found a storage shed where the owner demanded 6 months in advance payment. And so we thought it was a safe place to store our things. We were gathered up in the Pinedale Assembly Center. It's a small town, again, another small town. We're always associated, seems like, by small towns near Fresno. And I don't think we stayed overnight, but we were loaded onto a truck and then put onto a train, and it took us to Parker, Arizona. Poston had 3 camps, 1, 2, and 3, with probably a total population of maybe 20,000 people, separated about a mile apart. We were in Camp 2, second camp, Block 222, 2D. Each barrack was divided into 4 sections, right, Martha? 4.
Sure then.
I was 5, I can't remember. So the larger family got a little larger compartment than a couple. So anyway, it was our home for 3 years, from June of 1942 to August of 1945. We always spoke Japanese at home before the war, but when we were put into camp, we started to speak English, and my mother insisted that we speak English because we were in America, the land of the free. I'm a few months older than George Takei, Mr. Sulu of Star Trek, but somehow his memory of his camp days is a lot better than mine. I don't understand how he could remember more about camp than I do. He was interned briefly in Arkansas, and then to Tule Lake in Northern California. My memories of camp days included being intimidated by so many Japanese people who looked like me and spoke Japanese like us, in one assembly area. I felt like this was the whole world. Life in camp was terrifying when I left the security of our barrack. I couldn't imagine what all these Japanese people were doing here. Adjusting to this type of life was very difficult for me. It took me many years to adjust to a changing environment, even into adulthood. While in camp, if an adult found a scorpion, and there were many, they would round up all the kids and tell us that they were not toys but very dangerous creatures and not to touch them. We were admonished not to pick them up but report seeing one to an adult. I don't remember much of camp life except standing in line at the mess hall among strangers. After we had finished eating, all the children would run to the mess hall when we heard the gong sound, because that meant that there was some toasty, tasty fried rice from the bottom of a pot called koge. It means burnt rice. So whenever I burn rice at home, it brings back memories of camp. It was a welcome relief to return to the barrack, which was our home, whenever I felt lonely, even if I had my siblings. I was afraid to go to the communal bathroom without my mother. I do remember clearly playing jacks with a few of the neighbor kids in a cemented area whom I felt comfortable with. We played jacks, you know how when you scrape your fingers onto the cement, it starts bleeding. Well, we played until our fingers bled. Then we picked up playing jump rope. My father was our block manager, and he was one who would make sure everything was taken care of in a block of barracks. My mother worked in the mess hall, and on her off time, she still had a family to care for with a communal laundry room, minimal house cleaning, and it was rather easy because we just had one room and very meager belongings. Being a block manager, I think my father got paid $19 a month. My mother worked in the mess hall, and it was $16 a month. We had an outdoor theater where they would perform Japanese and kabuki dancing, and on the very cold nights, I remember my brother carrying a can of hot coals to keep us warm, because it was really just outdoors with the elements hitting us, cold, wind, whatever. I can't remember if we had any movie nights, if there were any. It would probably have been in Japanese, and we all understood Japanese when we were younger, so it would have been all right. But I know we had singing songs like Don't Fence Me In, Under the Cottonwood Tree, Daisy, Daisy. Whether this was in the theater or at school, that I don't remember. In Arizona, it got so hot. We enjoyed going to the swimming hole, which was a big dugout mud hole. Really, it wasn't. No cemented lining or anything. But it was just a place that had a lot of muddy water, but it was cool. We would just paddle around to keep cool, being careful not to swallow any of that yucky green water. While in camp, we got chicken pox, and our barrack was quarantined until all the pustules had dried up and fallen off, and then we were allowed to return to school. It was the four of us siblings, since my younger brother wasn't born until January of 1945. He paid for it after camp, because when he was about 8, he got a double whammy of chickenpox and mumps together. So it doesn't pay not to be born earlier and join the crowd. We returned to Reedley, California in August of 1945. My mother insisted or tried to make sure we returned in time for school. It had been 3 long years when we went to gather our belongings, but when we got to the storage shed, it had been ransacked. Very little was left for us to begin our new life with the $50 the government gave us. We, 7 of us, my parents and 5 of us siblings, lived for a very short time in my grandparents' garage until we found a house out in the very rural country through my grandparents' boss. This house had electricity, but no indoor plumbing. We had a hand pump for water to use for our vegetable garden. Oh God, did we hate to use pump water with the hand pump. And we did our washing on one of those scrub boards. You probably don't even know what scrub boards are. And it was for our household water and for baths. And we had a big, large, round, I don't know, it must be aluminum. I don't think they would make it out of tin or metal. And we had a pot-belly wood-burning stove to heat water for the bath and for the house and for whatever household purposes we needed water for. We had an outhouse where my older sister's job was to kill the black widow spiders living in there. Sears and Montgomery Ward catalogs were in our outhouse for reasons not to be mentioned here. We were lucky enough to have a roof over our heads and have a cozy home. Again, we were out in the rural area, and our neighbors are at least a half a mile away, so we had little to no contact with them, so we played together alone with our siblings. I attended a small country school. We had to walk a mile to and from school. were 2 grades. It was really a small school where there were 2 grades in one room. So when I came back from camp, I was in the 4th grade. My brother, older brother, was in the 8th grade, and my 2 sisters were in the 6th and 2nd. We were all in separate classrooms because 2 grades were together, but my siblings were all, unfortunately, not in my same room. I still felt a little apprehensive to be with strangers. There were no Japanese students in my class or in the whole school, and we had to get used to another environment again. Every morning, our teacher would start class with the reciting of the Pledge of Allegiance, hand over the heart, and we had to say the Lord's Prayer. I didn't know the meaning of the two, but since the teacher said to recite, I didn't protest. This was the first time I heard the words, "You dirty Jap," from a fellow classmate who was white. I didn't know the meaning of this until years later. I just assumed that I was dirty, but I knew I had had a bath the night before. I didn't know this was a derogatory term of prejudice or that racism even existed. I felt somewhat inferior at that moment because this was the first time we were with others of different nationalities. We were always with the Japanese people, Japanese community. We always associated with Japanese foods and all. Sometimes after school, my siblings and I would take a shortcut through someone's property to climb the mulberry tree to eat the delicious ripe fruit until the white owner caught us and finally chased us out and said to go home and never come back again. We heard those words in a loud, clear voice and never got to eat mulberries again. To this day, I hate the word camping because I felt I had been camping way too long. My parents could find work only as farm laborers from my grandparents who had worked for Mr. Collins, the boss. He was a nice man who trusted my parents because Japanese workers were known to be diligent and to work hard. He cared for them a lot, so he offered to sell them one of his properties. This land was miles closer to town. We weren't so isolated. There was a grocery store, and we got to ride a school bus. Again, we went to another grammar school where I started the 7th grade. I had a great teacher, Mrs. Wright. She was white. She made me feel quite comfortable in her class. She loved teaching art, and she loved folk dancing, and that's where I learned how to do the polka and the waltz. This school was still in a very rural area with no other Japanese students. I was now able to somewhat assimilate with my classmates who were Latinos and whites. Much of the labor for this property was provided by my 2 sisters, my older brother, and me. We would work before school, after school, before Japanese school, after Japanese school, before Sunday school, after Sunday school, and all the days that we had off. I must say, not much social life, but it sure kept us out of trouble. They would also hire workers when the crops were too much for a family to handle. There were always workers available from a Japanese labor camp. Of course, my parents would have to go pick them up and take them home. My parents knew how hard it was to work out on the farm and in the hot and cold weather. They always told us to go to school, get a profession that would take us out of the inclement weather. It would be so hot in Fresno that, oh my God, your sweat would just pour down, the gnats, wasps, everything would just cling to you. It was so hot. So my parents understood how important education was, which they could not get themselves. So they said, make sure you get a profession and then also buy a home as soon as you can, because you buy your own place, and you have an education. These are two things no one can ever take away from you. Those words we never forgot. While growing up, we didn't have much time for school activities, events, or even to associate with our classmates because we had to come home and work in the fields. Somehow or other, I was the senior high school class secretary. So says the yearbook. But I can't remember that. In high school, I would get together with the other Japanese students, not associating with the white or other nationalities. I don't know why. I guess it's still that intimidation or inferiority complex I had. I was still not very outgoing, but somehow or other, here I am. Ridley Junior College campus is next to the Ridley High School, and this is where I first saw an black African student who had to be out of Ridley by 10 p.m. There was a lot of talk in town about this awful event happening, a black student coming into town to go to school. Someone of color coming into our town and go to school? I still didn't realize what racism really was. After graduating from Ridley High in 1954, I went to the Fresno County General Hospital School of Nursing. It's a 3-year diploma school where you still got your license as an RN. I was the next to the last class to graduate. Then the Fresno State College took over the nursing program, where it became a 4-year program and you got your BS degree. This was the first time I had ever spent a night away from home alone. Again, I grouped together with 3 other Japanese student nurses and gradually learned to be with other races. I was one naive country student who was certainly wet behind her ears. Still, that intimidation fear factor was there because I thought the Japanese race was definitely inferior and that we were not their equal. Even after graduating nursing school and working in the maternity, labor and delivery department of the hospital, I was gradually easing out of my comfort zone, knowing that my work was comparable to the other nurses I had to work with. Whites, blacks, Latinos, no Asians again, and had to learn that Japanese nurses were just as qualified to do what was required as the others. I married my first husband, who was Japanese, in 1959. We had 2 wonderful children. Soon, I felt that my life wasn't being fulfilled or moving forward. I felt like I was at a standstill, and I thought to myself, is this what my life is going to be about for the rest of my life on earth? And I was very depressed about that. Well, we got divorced, and my children and I moved to Los Angeles in 1976. I got a job and bought a home. What a rude awakening, and how fast I had to give up my naivety. I learned how much our growing up with our Japanese culture instilled in us was so different from other races. I am not only speaking of our culture, conscience, and dignity, but of all races having their own differences in their own culture and upbringing. We were always taught to do your best in whatever we tackled and leave with a feeling of a job well done. I believe that religion is involved in the difference of how some of the Japanese American Buddhist people were raised and where they learned their values. Growing up, our family was strictly Buddhist, and my parents wanted us to follow that teaching. As adults, we were able to make our own choices, but I still remain a Buddhist. Other religions may have some effect on how they are influenced. My ways and beliefs are definitely old country, and I still think some of that old country is in me. But in some ways, I'm trying to infuse the old or modify the new in my thoughts. perhaps trying in a good way, or maybe in a bad way. I continued my nursing career at Kaiser, Southern California Permanente, and still found that prejudice existed in my workplace. I tried to put all that aside and concentrate on my work until I retired. Maybe it was just my attitude and perception that this was occurring, but I was very disappointed with the environment and dissatisfied in the actions or reactions I found even in the workplace. I retired in March 1999 and started a new career in cosmetology and got my license in March of 2000. I found much happiness in doing volunteer work at the Cairo Japanese retirement home, doing hairstyling for the Japanese people. I now realize that I am quite comfortable to feel as an equal with any race besides Japanese. I have acquired friends who are Japanese, Jewish, white, black, and whatever other races there may be. Indian. I have grown to find out that I can do what the other nationalities or races can do, and am not as subservient at the age of almost 78. Maybe being a senior citizen has its advantages. Yes, I think they do. You can just push your way in and say, "Oh, sorry, was this the line?" But could I have a second serving because I didn't have breakfast this morning and I do need to eat, and could you just give me just a little bit more? Just 5 pretzels in these little bags on the airlines? Not enough. I'm still a little hungry. Could I have another bag? They look at you and say, "Well, she's a senior. We'll give it to her." I tell you, there are advantages and disadvantages in growing old. Being old doesn't mean you have to just lay and just die. You can pick and choose. So, I play up my age pretty good, don't I, Martha? So sometimes when I'm always first in line to get that piece of pie, first in line to get that piece of cake or candy or whatever. I'm not going to miss out on anything that's free. Well, anyway, in 1988, I met Yoshi Kuromiya, my second husband. We've been married now for 25 years. He was a Heart Mountain draft resistor who signed a loyalty questionnaire that was being passed out to the adults and under certain conditions pertaining to questions numbers 27 and 28. The eligible men would gladly join the service only on the conditions that their family and friends were released from behind barbed wire fences and have their civil rights restored. Yosh refused, and he and 62 others went to trial and were found guilty and sentenced to 3 years at McNeil Island Penitentiary in the state of Washington in 1944. They were released in July 1946 after serving 26 months with time off for good behavior. The draft resistors were pardoned by President Harry S. Truman on Christmas Eve in 1947. Yosh didn't know anything about this until a friend notified him that the pardon was in the LA Times, and he had read this and told Yosh. Before Yosh and I were married, when did we get married? Yes. He asked me how it would be like if I were to marry a felon. This took me by surprise when he told me he was in prison. I asked why. Was he an axe murderer? Was he Jack the Ripper? This was the first time I had heard about the draft resistance in the camp, being in the camps. He then told me the story about being a draft resistor, because growing up, or after the war, my parents never spoke about camp life, or anything about it because they were too busy raising a family, going out to work. He told me all about the draft resistance, and I was then comfortable with the idea that I wouldn't see blood on my pillow, and I would be safe sleeping with him without having one eye open. We were married in 1989, that's the year, in Honolulu, Hawaii. This was about the time the draft resistors really came out of the closet. Yosh and Frank Yemi, one of the leaders of the Fair Play Committee, FBC, Frank served time at Leavenworth Penitentiary in Kansas. Together, they were invited to speak to many of the colleges and universities in California and Wyoming about why they answered yes to 27 and yes to 28 of the loyalty questionnaire, and why they were labeled as draft resistors or draft dodgers. They are labeled forever as draft resistors and sometimes called draft dodgers. That wasn't the reason they resisted the draft. Many books have been written about the draft resistors. Comments have been good and not so good. But the quest is still going on about the resistors and the war veterans who went to war to prove their loyalty and what good citizens they were. Many veterans did not come back to see how they had proved their loyalty and what good citizens they were by dying on the battlefield. Men have always had the power or control at the expense of women. Men have had the control and women the inconvenience. In the past social history, it was accepted and not questioned or challenged except in rare cases. These movements of women wanting to have an equal say-so in not only the workforce, but in inequality goes back to women's suffrage and even further back. Only recently has it become a public issue. The present generation is fortunate that you could talk about it, otherwise you would have been burned at the stake because men would have been threatened. Perhaps this role reversal occurred before I was born. It was during the 50s and 60s that I could remember about the roles women and men played in our lives. I first noticed this role when I entered nursing school, where there were no male nurses and job delegations were done accordingly with the help of male orderlies. Women were not to see or clean the male anatomy. But I found out this was my assignment when you work part-time in a small hospital as the RN in charge at night. What a shock. It was a rude awakening, even when you are married and you had to care for a male patient in all his glory. Thank goodness this patient was comatose and didn't know what I was doing to him. This was a time when I learned, well, you know what I was doing. I mean, I wasn't doing that, but I was doing something. I had to catheterize him because he couldn't urinate.
Oh, that's painful.
Yeah, but he didn't know what was happening, so I was safe. This was and I never had done this in nursing school, so this was my first. And I said, well, let me see now. How do I, where's the tweezers? Do I pick it up with the tweezers or what? I have my gloves on, so I said, oh, well, I guess this is what you do, you know. Just pick the thing up. And, well, I guess it has a name, but. And you put this tube in, and my God, did it go. Keep on I guess maybe nobody has ever been catheterized in this room, presumably. But it's not painful.
Yeah, right.
But of course I'm not male. Let's see. This was the time when I learned what roles were expected from women and from men. None of us were expected to accept the roles we were placed in, but much to the consternation of our parents if we chose the roles of being lesbian or gay. The feminine role is anything less than the masculine role. This is also a preconditioning handed down from previous generations. The male is just as entrapped in their role as the female by social pressure. My parents would have been upset if my older brother showed interest in dolls and if my older sister showed interest in machinery. My last words. During camp days and after, I was too young and afraid of any new experience. Sexism and femininity in camp and after were not in my vocabulary. And of course, my zodiac sign would have to be the Scorpio, a sign which means to heal and empower. I hope I have brought something to the class that you may store in some part of the brain. Thank you for listening to me.
Oh, thank you.